Conversation quality impacts employee engagement and your bottom line. Sponsored by Fierce and presented by Beth Wagner and Megan Maslanka. Beth has more than 17 years of professional development experience. Beth has a unique talent for helping individuals maximize their leadership potential and propel organizational effectiveness. For the past 4 years, Beth has worked directly with the Fierce Learning team to facilitate workshops, develop a global community of facilitators, and design content for the suite of Fierce program offerings. Megan Maslanka, Client Success Director, leads the team of client advisor and insight analysts and implementation managers who support Quantum Workplace's 400-plus clients with employee engagement technology to make work better every day. Megan coaches enterprise clients on structuring engagement and performance programs to best suit their environment and acting on employee feedback to improve their workplaces. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that this webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI credit and can also be used for SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. After the webcast, you'll receive an email from HR.com within 1 to 2 business days. It will include your certification credit information. You can also log into HR.com and go to your View My Credits page where you can see the credits that you've received. If you have any questions today for our presenters or for HR.com, please type them into the Questions tab on your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll be sure to follow up with you. And it's now my pleasure to turn you over to our presenters.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sylvie. On behalf of Fierce and on behalf of Quantum Workplace, I just want to say thank you to HR.com and thank you to all of you for joining us today. This is Beth. And I want to start us off with what our time together today looks like, just a bit of an agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about the survey results that Quantum Workplace and Fierce were able to derive from the survey that we held earlier this year. So we'll share some of those with you. And then specifically, we're going to start to target what you can do as a leader, as an individual, to start increasing conversation quality in your organization, as well as building a culture of voice empowerment. So we'll talk a little bit more about both of those and give you some real tools to walk away here with today. And then we'll wrap it up with some bottom line impacts, some information about how increasing conversation quality and building that voice empowerment culture can actually add to the bottom line, and end with some question and answer, because I'm sure this group has brought some really juicy questions. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right in, and I'm going to start with the survey. Just to level set the group a bit, Quantum Workplace and Fierce Inc. came together this year to design a survey that was distributed back in June, and it was intended to capture perceptions on workplace conversations, miscommunication, and employee engagement. And that's really what Megan and I are here to talk with you about today. The high-level survey results that we received, the insights those surveys provided, and most importantly, what you can do to have those high-quality conversations and build a voice-empowered culture in your organization. So, what did we learn? We learned a lot from this survey, actually. First, we learned that only half of workplace conversations are great. Half of survey respondents reported having great or excellent conversations at work, regardless of who they were speaking with, which actually means that the flip side of that coin is also true. Half of employees rated their conversations as less than great. So the big question that we had was, why aren't people having better conversations? Now, given my work, our work at Fierce, we would say it's because high quality conversations aren't easy to have. They require a level of skill that's necessary if we really want to create change and produce real results. Skills that we at Fierce have taught for nearly 2 decades to thousands of leaders around the globe. And our survey results show that when these skills are learned, when they're put into practice, and you're going to get a window into some of these today, it has an effect on everyone that we work with. For many of us, the biggest barrier to high quality conversations is actually our own fear. We are afraid to share what we are really thinking and feeling, so we skirt the issue, we dodge the real conversation, we kind of chicken out when the opportunity is on the table to voice our concerns. I mean, let's face it, It's not easy to challenge your boss's perspective, right? It's not easy to tell your peer that their communication style is causing confusion and slowing a project down. These conversations are the ones that I say make our hearts race and our palms sweaty. They're not easy, and it's scary. Being real is scary, and yet I would contend that it's the unreal conversations, so the ones that we tiptoe around, the ones we avoid altogether, that should really scare us the most, because those are the conversations that cost us tremendously. They cost us time, they cost us frustration, resources, trust, and I'm going to put that word in capital letters because we're going to talk about that more today. They even impact our bottom line. One of the reasons that conversations impact so many aspects of our business is really due to the strong tie that conversations have to employee engagement. And to talk to us a little bit more about that, I'm going to hand it over to Megan.
Great, thanks, Beth. Yes, we know that miscommunication in the workplace is really impactful, and it could hurt individuals' bottom line, but what does that actually mean? So when we think about communication in the workplace, and we think about how are great conversations actually linked to higher engagement. Part of our survey that we conducted this June actually gave us some insight to exactly just that. So right here, we're looking at the relationship between engagement and speaking your mind. So the blue bar represents the coworker conversations if you speak your mind in coworker conversations, and the orange bar represents if you speak your mind in manager conversations. So obviously this shows that there is a positive correlation between engagement and speaking your mind. When you think about individuals on the far right of this graph, that they say they always speak their mind, either to coworkers or to their manager, this is a higher engaged group than those individuals on the far left that say they never speak their mind, either between their coworkers or their manager. What's interesting here too is you notice the relationship between coworkers and managers. Oftentimes we think that speaking your mind to your manager may be more difficult and may impact your engagement differently if your manager doesn't help or doesn't understand your point of view. But what this shows is that it is also tough, and it also impacts your engagement about speaking your mind to your coworkers. So this is a really interesting data point that came out of this survey that helps us understand a bit deeper about this miscommunication and the ability to speak your mind and how that actually impacts your engagement. Now, I'm going to turn it back to Beth to walk through some fierce strategies before we get to 5 at the end.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. So how do you increase, and we know that quality conversations are tied to employee engagement. How do we increase the number of quality conversations on our team and in our organization? And that's what we're going to talk about next. I mentioned just a minute ago that one of the biggest barriers to high quality conversations is our own fear. And I want to share another barrier before I introduce these strategies, which I know we're chomping at the bit to hear, but I want to share one more barrier before introducing those. Our survey found that 81% of employees know that miscommunication happens across their workplace. 81% of people are very much aware that this problem exists. Okay, so if that many people are aware it's happening, if we know it's having an impact, why aren't we doing more to change that? That's the big question, right? The answer is simple, and yet it's kind of profound at the same time. The answer is that people don't see themselves as part of the problem. In fact, when it comes to miscommunication, over half of employees adopt what we call an "it's not me, it's you" attitude. And that in turn becomes another barrier to having high quality conversations. So what happens is we lose sight of true accountability, and employees tend to stick to the story that they were never, almost never, rarely ever involved in the workplace miscommunication. And why is this? Why do we insist on keeping ourselves at arm's length from a problem that has such drastic repercussions? Well, consider this. I mean, how many of you wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I'd really like to be a part of a problem that's impacting me, my team, and my entire organization in a negative way? I want to be one of the reasons that things aren't getting done. No, none of us want this, right? None of us say that. We separate ourselves from miscommunication at work because, and this is according to Dan Harris from Quantum Workplace, and I love it, it allows us to reason that we're not to blame, somebody else is. So by separating ourselves from the problem, we're able to defend our self-worth. We're still okay. It's the other person that needs to change. And that's something that we can rationally wrap our brains around much easier than saying, hey, I'm part of this larger problem. This is actually classically defined, there's a term out there for this, as the victim mindset. So in other words, what we say is, if she, he, they, or it were different, I'd be just fine. So if my boss were better at communicating our team priorities, I'd be hitting my numbers right now. My boss needs to get their act together, then I can do my job. So, I'm just gonna wait till my boss decides to change, and gee, I hope they do that fast. How effective have you, in your role, in your organization, experienced this victim mindset to be? Does it actually change anything? No, of course not, right? The problem persists. So this mindset, while it might feel good to adopt in the moment, because here again, it puts us at arm's length from quote unquote, the danger of having responsibility in this problem, is actually a barrier to reducing miscommunication because it prevents us from having the real conversation. At Fierce, we believe that taking accountability means having the real conversation needs to take place, even if it feels risky. And oftentimes, when it comes to miscommunication, those are risky conversations. Some of you may even be thinking right now, this is great, Beth, but I still don't believe this is my responsibility. I mean, shouldn't the top leaders be the ones to have these conversations? Shouldn't the top leaders be the ones to own up to this organizational miscommunication issue that we're having? I mean, it all comes from the top, right? Interestingly, and I'll share another piece of data from our survey, if you look at this, interestingly, over 50% of our survey respondents believe just the opposite. So they believe that all employee groups are responsible for reducing miscommunication and having the conversation. In fact, if you look at HR, I think sometimes we believe, most people would think, oh, it's an HR issue, right? Or it's a supervisor, a manager, or a leadership issue. When in fact, in our survey, most people said, no, yes, we admit all employee groups are responsible for this, because quite frankly, miscommunication can and does occur at every level. And it becomes a bigger issue where open and honest conversations are the exception, not the rule. So it becomes important that at all levels, leaders are able not only to hold themselves able to prevent and resolve miscommunication on their own team, but also to resolve miscommunication organization-wide. When we see a conversation needs to take place, it is we who must invite it. It's so easy to say, well, that's not my issue, or they need to solve for that. And if we see that conversation is necessary, it's us who needs to invite that conversation. So once we invite the conversation, the big question becomes, how do we improve our conversation quality? How do we ensure that we do build engagement, that we do improve the relationships in the workplace and improve our bottom line? So this is where we enter the 3 Fierce strategies. We're going to talk about this in terms of both team meetings, how to build this quality of conversation in meetings, as well as one-on-one conversations. And these are simple but not simplistic. I'm going to repeat that a couple of times. Set an intention, open it up for dialogue, and set clear next steps. And in my, nearly 18 years now of working with leaders and leadership development and in HR, these are things that quite often get missed when it comes to having these conversations. So we're going to talk about these. The first is to set the intention of the conversation. So how do you do this in a team meeting? How do you do this? Well, the easiest way to put this is go into the conversation prepared, which I know is easier said than done sometimes, but I have a question for this group. How many of you have ever been to a meeting that was lacking an agenda or lacking a purpose or a timeline, and you walked out of that meeting no more clear on what you needed to do or the team needed to do? Could have been the last meeting that you stepped out of. I think we have these experiences quite often, and we're banging our head against the wall thinking, didn't we just have this meeting last week? Why are we doing this again? I don't feel that we're solving for anything. So when this happens, how do we feel? Oftentimes we feel frustrated or confused. At the very least, we're not excited to go into our next team meeting, right? Successful team meetings don't happen by getting everyone into a room and flying by the seat of our pants. I think oftentimes we feel like if the meeting's on the agenda, we've done our job. It'll get done. And yet holding meetings without an agenda is like trying to drive from point A to point B without road signs. You can't get anywhere. So at Fierce, we work hard to teach teams how to have more effective meetings by way of preparation. One of the most critical aspects of a successful meeting is to have an agenda. Here again, simple but profound. It's important to get clear about the issue you're discussing, what you're trying to accomplish, and more importantly, sharing those thoughts with team members in advance of the meeting. This isn't just going to help meeting participants focus their attention and thoughts prior to the meeting, but it's also going to help you get the best possible participation from everyone. So ask yourself before you enter any meeting, what is the issue and why is it important? And have I communicated that to those people that I'm inviting to this meeting? Now, the second thing that we're going to talk about is one-on-one conversations. How do you set the intention when you're speaking with just one other individual? So when trying to reduce miscommunication, I'll tell you what doesn't work. Catching people in the hallway, springing something on them in the parking lot, or flying into their office to do a dump and run on your way to your next meeting is not effective. And yet I think that we all have the best of intentions. I truly believe that as leaders and in our businesses. And yet at the pace we're moving, we don't often give ourselves the time to have the conversations that matter. Fly-by dialogue doesn't do the heavy lifting. So schedule time for the conversation. This is one-on-ones. Determine the gravity of the information you're sharing. I mean, if the conversation is important, then treat it that way. Bumping into someone between meetings with a, hey, I've been needing to talk with you, you're not meeting your deadlines, and the client is upset, that doesn't work. It's going to leave that individual reeling, confused, frustrated. So make the conversation a priority, because not only will you have the other person's full attention, but they'll have yours, right? In addition to scheduling time, we'll go back to what we do at team meetings, create structure. Agendas are not just reserved for group meetings. It's important to think through the issue, the impact it's having, and put your due diligence into preparing for the conversation. Oftentimes I get leaders saying to me, geez, Beth, I barely have time for the meetings in my day, let alone preparing for those. I just expect to show up, and the people that I hired to do their job well will provide me with insight. I think as a business culture, we've lost the art of having conversations because of the need for speed. And yet, I want to suggest to this group and encourage this group, how do we slow down to speed up? Slowing down to have the conversations that matter so that we can speed up at the speed of business, at the speed of results that we're looking to achieve. So this is number one. The second strategy is to open it up for dialogue. So consider this. Who owns the truth in your organization? Who owns the truth about your company or your team? The answer is every single person in the company owns a piece of the truth. And no one can possibly own the entire truth, because no one can possibly view the team or the organization from all perspectives all of the time. The problem occurs when, as individuals or leaders, we stand our ground on our positions or beliefs, and we're not open to learning about other people's truths or how our decision impacts them. Learning, because I use that word, learning does not mean that you have to change your decision or position. It simply means you are open to being curious and influenced. That's it. You have a choice in every conversation. You can ignore the valuable perspectives that exist out there, or you can actively invite them to be shared. It's your choice. To ensure, however, that you're creating clarity, that you're engaging actively employees on your team, that you're making the best possible decisions, it is critical to invite those differing, sometimes competing perspectives. So how do we do this in a team setting? Believe it or not, meetings actually have the tendency to curb communication. So even though we're all sitting in the same room, we're all looking at each other, we're all hearing the same person share the same information at the same time, over 55% of our respondents said that miscommunication is more likely to occur in group conversation. So just because you put your entire team into one room does not guarantee clarity, nor does it guarantee that everyone's going to share their unique perspective. So how do you ensure that all voices get heard? How can you ensure that you get the perspectives you need to make the best decision? Actively seek input from others. So sometimes as leaders, we get this crazy notion in our head that we need to have all the answers and dictate all the responsibilities. That's our job, right? Now, if all we ever do is make command control decisions as leaders, if we never ask for input from our teams, it can lead to some big problems. For instance, it can lead to something that we at Fierce call lovingly the corporate nod. So if you've ever been in a meeting where the leader is telling you how great their plan is, and you look around to see everyone nodding in compliant agreement, this is what we're talking about. If you've ever sat, most of us have sat there in that meeting while doing the corporate nod ourselves, thinking to ourselves, this isn't going to work. Or I'm so confused, I haven't even caught up to where they're at because you lost me 5 minutes ago. But you know what? Maybe if I nod a little bit quicker, this meeting will get over sooner. When we don't actively ask for input, we can also be at risk for resentful compliance. So this is where people do just enough to get by, just enough to meet the what's expected, but no more. Or worse, individuals feel that their point of view is underappreciated and they feel undervalued. So that's a lack of engagement right there, right? So when in a team setting, make sure you're actively seeking the perspectives of other people. Again, this forces you to slow down to speed up. This is not a one-way dialogue where I'm going to tell you what needs to happen and then we're going to break and everybody's going to go do their thing. Ask questions, get curious, and invite the conversation to happen. And miscommunication can occur in one-on-one conversations as well. If you have that feeling that what you said is a far cry from what the other person heard, you've been there. And there's an author by the name of Joseph Pine who said once, the experience of being understood versus interpreted is so compelling that you could charge admission. And it's true, because unfortunately, true understanding is rare. We fall into a trap of assuming that our interpretation is accurate. So we say things like, well, that's how I see it, so surely that's how everybody else must see it too. How do you prevent misunderstanding or misinterpretation in your one-on-ones? It's simple, and I've used this terminology already. Get curious. The biggest tip is to ask questions. I would ask you to survey yourself in your next meeting. How many questions are you asking versus how many declarative statements are you making? It's important to allow the other person space to share their own perspective. While it's also important as leaders that we share our perspective, that we share our thoughts, it's also important to put our ideas, assumptions, and concerns aside and to shift the conversation to the other person. Lean into questions such as, what do you think? What would you like to see happen? What are your concerns about what I just shared? Am I missing anything? What else? When listening to the other person's perspective, it's also critical that we share back what we're hearing. So we call that paraphrasing. Don't be satisfied with what's on the surface, because remember, we're trying to avoid assumption making. So for example, you can say, can I tell you what I'm hearing? I want to be sure I'm understanding you. The job of a leader is to create space for people to express their thoughts, for people to be able to clear the way to do their jobs well. And it's important that we provide that environment of true understanding, not just interpretation. So that's number 2. And finally, number 3 is to set clear next steps. You know, a conversation can generate a whole slew of great ideas. The question is, how are you turning these ideas into action? So to do this in a team meeting, before the meeting even adjourns, it's important to discuss next steps. And this should be built into every single meeting agenda. So often, teams will take up the entire meeting discussing the problem or opportunity, and then we get to the end and we think, oh, we'll just schedule another follow-up meeting and see how that's going. But we don't leave enough time to answer the question, now what? Now what do we do? So make that a norm of your meetings. Be sure you're leaving ample time, whether that's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, to discuss next steps. Specifically, what are we all committing to doing? So that when we come back together, we can check in on that, on the actual action. Get specific. One and done meetings are not always enough. So that's why I say when we're talking about next steps, it may require that you have a follow-up meeting as well. As we know, as you know, reality is constantly changing. And what we talked about yesterday may no longer be relevant today. The economy is changing, our client base is changing, the global landscape is evolving. It's critical to stay connected on the decisions and the action plans and ensure that what we're doing, the action that we're taking, is still relevant. And it's in the best interest of us, our team, our organization. And it also helps us avoid the momentum. Avoid losing the momentum that we just created in this meeting. So that's in team meetings. And a similar approach to our team meetings is applicable for one-on-ones. Before you wrap up the conversation, are you asking that simple question with those two words, now what? Now what? What's the most potent step we can take to move this issue towards resolution? Potent, not just what's the low-hanging fruit. What's the easiest step? What's the most potent step we can take to really give us some momentum? When will we take it? What might get in our way? So how will we get past that? Identifying barriers. And then how do we set up a follow-up conversation with each other? Now what? Profound, two little words. These concepts, these three strategies, like I said, are simple, but they're not simplistic. And the reason I know that is because truly, we don't practice them enough as leaders. We are trying to cut the corners, and that's costing us a lot. So while it's important to build the skill set, which I just shared with you, some of those tools of having great conversations, equally as important is establishing the culture within your organization that supports it. So a space where people feel empowered to share their thoughts, to ask questions, to have the real conversation, because without both pieces, without the skill set and the culture, employees could have the skill to have those great conversations, but they're not likely to invite the conversations to take place. So how do you build the culture you need in order for the skill to work? And for that, I'm going to hand it over to Megan to talk us through it.
Great. Thank you, Beth. That was really helpful, and it really gives us a good foundation when we think about how do you build that culture of what we call voice empowerment. So oftentimes organizations may not even realize what is voice empowerment, or how do they build that organization, that culture essentially where individuals can speak their mind and share their voice. We call this the silent culture killer. Organizations that we partner with don't even realize the impact that this may have on their engagement or on their organization and ultimately their productivity. So interestingly enough, when we ask questions like there is open and honest communication throughout all levels of this organization on an engagement survey, and an organization scores low, the first thing people go to do, or leaders go to do, is to build in more avenues for communication. It's more of a top-down approach that is consistently happening. If we score low and there's open, honest communication, I'm going to schedule another town hall, or our leadership will hold monthly sessions with their leaders to make sure that they understand the information. But that's not really what it's about. When you think about building this culture of voice empowerment, it is more than just a top-down communication strategy. And so when we think about, too far ahead, when we think about how often do employees, when we ask the question on the survey, do employees always or almost always speak their minds? When you actually look at this, 51.9% say that they almost always or always share their minds or share their opinions with their managers. Now, with coworkers, it's a little bit less so. And what this indicates, what's most interesting about this data point, is that it suggests that our respondents are more comfortable or more frequently open up with their managers than their coworkers. And Beth talked about a lot of those dynamics, that it could be the social pressures of your peers, but this is good that individuals feel a little bit more comfortable sharing their minds, speaking their opinion, giving feedback on different topics in the organization with their managers. But how do we build on that? So when we look at this even a little bit more granularly, and we're looking at the coworker conversations versus the manager conversations, again, we're seeing this overlap that the more comfortable an individual is in an organization to sharing their minds or speaking their mind, sharing feedback, and they're saying that they almost always or always share feedback, it results in higher engagement. So individuals that are highly engaged in organizations also feel comfortable sharing their mind. And if you think about what that can do for your business and what that does for productivity, no longer, Beth calls it the corporate nod, no longer are we just kind of resting on the conversation from a manager and taking every idea as it is. We're getting and inviting employees into this conversation to say, how do we push these ideas forward? Is this the right path forward? What does this mean for you? Versus saying, this is my vision as a leader and this is what this means for you. So it's a really nice way to say that obviously when you have this culture of voice empowerment and individuals feel comfortable speaking their minds, it results in higher engagement. So now we're going to cover from the quantum workplace side 5 kind of leadership lessons for creating this culture that we seek to achieve. First tip, build a foundation of trust. Now, I know there was even a comment already that came in around this topic of trust, and how do you build trust within an organization? How do you not let leaders get defensive when we share feedback or we speak our minds clearly? And organizations, when they do feel free to speak their mind and we have this trusting environment and we can integrate different conversations, obviously this has a huge impact on engagement. So first tip, and you can see obviously here the essential activities of trusted leaders. You can download this ebook that gives you 35 different activities, but a few of the key ones here: communicate transparently and authentically. When you think about that survey question that I just touched on, there's open and honest communication throughout the organization. A lot of times what it is really talking about is, do we have transparency? Your employees are really smart. If we think we are being savvy and communicating or talking around an issue, employees can understand the elephant in the room, and they lose trust in the organization if we are not being transparent. And sometimes that transparency just means we have to tell our employees, our teams, that, you know what, that is a topic I cannot yet discuss, or we are not able to share that information, rather than skirting the issue. Another thing that we think about when you think about building trust in organizations is, are you a vulnerable leader? Vulnerable gets used quite often, but if something is of a concern to you and you're hiding your emotion or the passion behind that, employees are less likely to trust you. So if you say you're going to do something, are you living up to that conversation? If an topic happens in the organization, maybe an organizational change or an external environment change, do you really share your feedback with your employees on how the situation is unfolding? Or are you playing the role of the leader and acting as if you should act rather than how you really feel about the situation? So most importantly, with building a foundation of trust, it's about communicating transparently and authentically. It's about being vulnerable. And then lastly, it's about being fair. So process should be consistent. A lot of times employees may not interpret an interaction or a situation as fair. Maybe you're communicating out a change that has happened, and it really impacts that individual. If they may not perceive it to be fair at first, but the process should be consistent and interaction should be respectful. So if you can really walk through that situation with the individual and help explain about the fair process and the respectful interactions, that only reinforces your foundation of trust. It doesn't mean all individuals are going to like the decision or the message that you're sharing, but they need to be able to trust the process and trust the interaction. So that's really tip number 1 when you think about this culture of voice empowerment, is to build the foundation of trust. It is not easy, but it's definitely tip number 1. When you think about suggestion number 2, this topic, Beth mentioned a little bit, but it's really about creating a safe space, or what oftentimes in the industry is called psychological safety. So within your team, think about your own team interactions, or you think about your leadership team interactions. Are there consequences for speaking up? If employees feel a fear that sharing their thoughts has some potential to impact their professional development, their social status, their physical or emotional risks tied to that, are you creating that safe space? We often talk about the SCARF model from David Rock that talks about someone's status. And if you are unable to create this safe space within the team, your team environment, or your leadership team, and individuals may fear speaking up, this doesn't help us foster that voice empowerment culture. In a lot of ways that you as a leader can think about, how am I creating this psychological safety in my team or in my one-on-one conversations? It doesn't give employees the right to say things disrespectfully or speak without kind of really thinking things through, but it does create an environment where you can explore a topic together. You can explore a message or information, or maybe to the example Beth gave earlier, if you're going to have a drive-by conversation, with your team to say, hey, you're not delivering to the client's needs, you really want to create this environment to help explore and understand what is happening. Allow the individual to ask questions too and speak their mind from their point of view so that you can build this safe space so that they shouldn't have fears of any consequences for speaking up. That is tip number 2, really creating the psychological safety within teams, but creating that safe space even within your one-on-one conversation. Tip number 3 really kind of builds off that, is to be open and supportive of ideas. Beth calls this learning. It's the exact same kind of approach about, as a leader, when you're thinking about either your leadership team or an individual leader or manager in your organization, are you open and supportive of these ideas? Are you seeking to understand either the outcome of or the results of what have happened in a situation, or is your mind already made up? Do you have your decision made and you may not want to understand the team member's perspective or your employee's perspective? To Beth's point, this does not mean you have to change your mind or your decision, but you do need to be open to decisions. And then when it talks about being supportive of decisions, a lot of times where we see this kind of failing with the organizations we partner with is individuals may feel like they can give feedback to management, but they don't close the loop on that. And they don't know what's happening with that idea or that suggestion. And so when we say be open and supportive of ideas, this is really about how you're going to continue to get feedback over time and build that voice-empowered culture. As a manager, are you asking questions? Are you encouraging them to think differently about some of the ideas going forward? Do you ask the question about, have you thought through what is next as a team member versus you leading that for them? Sometimes we also rely on past legacy situations, and us as leaders need to pause and say, am I letting an outdated example or a legacy example impact my bias towards this idea? Maybe I felt like I've tried this idea years ago and it no longer works. That is something that we want to still explore it with fresh eyes and give it a fresh chance if there's a business case that warrants that. Tip number 4 of 5 is to respond. I talked a little bit about closing the loop. One of the best questions you can ask your employees, either in a one-on-one conversation or on an engagement survey, is, have I followed up on your ideas and opinions? Or a more official question is, when feedback is given to management, it is well received and followed up on. You must respond to the ideas and the information coming, the feedback, the voice from your population. If you are constantly asking or getting input from the organization, but nothing happens with that input, it is discouraging. It doesn't create this culture where you can speak up and realize that your voice is valued. We know kind of universally one of the big drivers of engagement, regardless of organizational size or industry, is around your employees finding their voice. And if they feel like my opinion seems to count at work or my voice matters, that is really critical and a key driver of engagement universally. So not only saying, does my opinion matter or seem to count at work, but what are we doing with that feedback? What's the point for individuals in your organization to give feedback to management, to you as a leader, if you're not going to do anything with it? We often say your engagement survey is your first form to demonstrate that you want a voice-empowered culture. You spend all this time launching an engagement survey or conducting ad hoc pulse surveys for your organization to collect feedback to see how engagement is trending. But if we don't follow up and share the feedback that received or take action on that feedback, there was really no point in conducting that survey or asking for ad hoc pulsing or ad hoc surveying in the first place. It falls on deaf ears. And over time, the more we ask individuals to give us feedback, but the less we do it, the more bitter those employees will come. I know from experience, if I'm asked for input on a topic, but I have no idea what's happening with my suggestions or my feedback, it's demotivating to me as an individual. I don't feel like I'm contributing to the organization. So that is tip number 4 out of 5. The last suggestion to really build that voice-empowered culture is around providing guidance. In the best organizations we partner with, feedback is welcome. It's expected and respectful and professional. So when you think about providing guidance, you want to provide direct feedback to your employees if they use language that's not appropriate or make others feel uncomfortable. Now, this goes kind of to close the entire loop. So individuals, you want to create that safe space, build that foundation of trust, be open to their ideas, and follow up on their ideas. But if ideas are shared in an inappropriate or unprofessional way, or if it's not respectful of the prior culture of the organization, it is your job as managers and leaders to share that guidance, share that feedback with those individuals, guide them to giving better feedback over time, guide them in terms of how they're delivering that and how they're valuing voice, because you may, as a manager, be very flexible with how someone delivers you feedback or shares their voice and concern. But if they move roles, if they go into another leader, if they report into another leader, you want them to have the skill set to really make an impact with their voice. And that starts with you too. That means that you have to make sure that they know that their feedback is still valuable, that you can learn a ton from their feedback, but there's a really good way to kind of create that open and honest space and deliver feedback that will be well received. A lot of times we know that feedback is difficult. We call it a gift, but it is tough to receive if it is unexpected or if it's not delivered in a way that is helpful for driving the business forward. So when you think through those 5 tips, really about building a foundation of trust, about making sure that you create psychological safety in your teams, that you're open and supportive of ideas, you respond to ideas, and you're providing guidance on building that feedback muscle and building that muscle, that's how you build an organization that has a culture of being voice empowered. It's not about creating more tactics. It's not about adding in a newsletter, or some of our clients add in blogs. All of that is great to share information, but it is really a top-down style of a communication, and you're not building that muscle around employees' voice. And that's really what you need to do to kind of work on communication. I know Beth and I have shared a lot. I'm going to toss it over to Beth, to wrap up, and then we'll jump into Q&A.
Thank you so much. And you guys may see a little bit of something different right here. I think I'm going to, I apologize if you're seeing a different screen right now, but we're going to swap for just a moment and see if we can get some new slides going. So I apologize for, what I want to talk about though, as we get these new slides up, I'm so sorry, folks. Just one moment. Okay, so off we go. So articles are popping up, and I apologize for that technical glitch, but we did switch out a few slides at the last minute, so here we go. We're back on board. And talking about the conclusion, and I appreciate all of Megan's piece. One of the biggest things that pops up to me, and I said the word trust from the very beginning of today. That word trust seems to be elusive for many of us. We talk about it, we throw it around, we say there's not enough trust, we need more trust, there's a gap in trust. And yet I think it boils down to a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today. How do you build in that psychological safety for your teams? How do you start to encourage that dialogue and create that culture of voice empowerment? And articles are popping up every single day citing the costs of low employee engagement, whether that's $300 billion a year, $500 million, or just even the cost to replace one high potential employee. The costs of low employee engagement are just too high. And the inverse is true as well, actually. While low engagement is really expensive, high engagement has huge rewards. And in conclusion, I just want to share a little bit about those rewards and the impact that you can see on your bottom line. In fact, you've probably heard this, but higher engagement, higher engagement leads to better performance. In fact, organizations that ranked in the top 25% for employee engagement perform better overall than other organizations. Surveys also show that they have 21% higher productivity on average, 22% higher profitability, 37% lower absenteeism, and actually 65% lower turnover. Those are real numbers. And those are based on organizations that seem to be in the top 25% for employee engagement. So based on the results from the 1,300 plus employees that we surveyed, the correlation between employee engagement and conversation quality and culture is absolutely clear, because employee engagement is directly linked to conversation quality. So investing in that skill set can truly impact your bottom line. And we know from working with thousands of organizations on building these skill sets that missing or ineffective conversations are actually at the root of most business problems. It can be linked back to those missing or ineffective conversations. In fact, I just want to share a little bit of data with you so that you can see how this plays out from a client perspective. One of our fierce clients, Randstad Canada, and they've been kind enough to let us share their story with you, tested this theory and invested in training to address conversation quality, and they saw an impact on both engagement and revenue. And I want to share those numbers with you. In 2013, they had what we call at Fierce a suddenly moment, and realized their engagement was at 69%, their retention rate was 55%, they weren't sharing resources across teams, and their revenue was down. In fact, it was 2% below market value. After bringing fierce conversations into Randstad Canada and addressing this issue of quality of conversations that we're having, they got to a different result. In fact, from 69% engagement, they increased to 79%. They went from 55% retention to 82%. They went from being 2% below market in revenue to 3% above, which is huge. And they even will tell you, and they've shared this so many times over, that while those numbers are impressive and they're very proud of them, their biggest pride lies in the fact that they became the #1 recruiting and staffing services firm in Canada. And they link that directly back to that uptick in skill set, that ability for people in the organization to have those conversations, those quality conversations. And that's just one example of the power that quality conversations can have. In terms of Quantum Workplace's research, communication is obviously foundational to a lot of aspects that drive engagement. Engagement not only increases productivity and retention, but it also increases or impacts your employees' likeliness to be advocates for your organization. So they start to advocate for you. And many organizations that Quantum Workplace partners with work on communication as a foundation to seeing engagement results improve from 3% to 5% in a year-over-year comparison. So these are all real numbers to share with you and show you that while our survey results kind of kicked off a whole series of tips and tools and strategies, bottom line is there's a real ROI here. There's a real return on investment. So in summary, when we're looking at employee engagement, obviously it's important to identify what's underlying, right? What's going on beneath the surface to cause that disengagement. As our survey results show, it's more often than not miscommunication. So whether it's conversations like those we discussed in the team meetings or in one-on-one interactions, or even what Megan shared around building that culture of voice empowerment and trust, it's clear that how you are communicating in your team and organization really matters. And it can have huge implications, huge. So with that, on behalf of Megan, myself, Fierce Quantum Workplace, I just want to say thank you to all of you for being with us today. And I want to save some time for Q&A. We have a couple of minutes remaining here, about 10, and I think Megan's been tracking a few questions along the way, so I'm going to toss it over to her, and we'll hopefully have some time to bounce some questions back and forth. Megan?
Yes, great. Beth, I think this first one, maybe you can take a stab at it and then I can jump in. It's a lot about the topic of trust or lack of trust. So what happens when you communicate with your manager and he or she takes your feedback personally? Eventually, that could lead to some sort of retaliation. What about if the individual may not trust the HR team and go talk to HR isn't the right answer? Kind of what are some suggestions or tips to kind of working through trust if you feel like you've got an uphill battle with your manager?
Yeah, it's probably my #1 question is to say that sort of what if, and a lot of people think about their current relationship. So especially when we talk at Fierce, really sort of some of the precursor to having these conversations is to ask yourself, what is the current relationship that I have with this individual? And it should not prevent you from having the conversation, but more to consider how to approach the conversation. So I'll just get a little bit more specific. When we talk about confronting someone, if you're confronting a boss, oftentimes people will say, well, they'll talk themselves right out of the conversation because they'll say, well, I'm afraid of retaliation, or I don't know what they're going to think, or they're not going to think the same way I am, or they're going to react badly. So they talk themselves right out of the conversation. Interestingly enough, those fears that we have, retaliation, loss of relationship, they're going to get angry or get upset, are likely to happen somewhere down the road if we aren't having these clear and direct conversations. So first and foremost, when people say, well, what if? My question back is, consider what the benefits are if you have the conversation and it goes well. And I just want to stress with that too, oftentimes I think we get into a rut because people invite the conversation without the skill set behind it. And that's a bit like a freight train out of control. So I believe that just as important as inviting the conversation is to have the skill set, which you will see will shift the trajectory of the conversation and probably prevent a lot of those HR conversations from having to happen at that level where we can still invite the conversation with individuals, even our bosses. I hope that helps. And Megan, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, no, I think that's great feedback. I think a quick win, or sometimes even if you're an individual and you're thinking about, maybe I have this manager where I feel like I cannot give feedback, some simple suggestions that we sometimes think about is really just kind of teeing the conversation up. Sometimes we blindside people with feedback. And so if you can prepare them for the conversation, give them a little bit of context, and even kind of talk about maybe the elephant in the room, so to speak, around this may be uncomfortable. I know this is a tough topic, but I really feel the need to share this feedback or to share or to speak my mind, etc. Sometimes teeing it up helps in a small win, but I think Beth is right. Long term, you've really got to build that skill set, and the long-term payoff is always better. Okay, one more question that has come in. Communication is always an area to work on from survey feedback. When conducting surveys, how do you recommend really understanding what needs to be improved with communication? That's all. I'll maybe start on this one, and then you can obviously jump in. I think oftentimes when we work with individuals or organizations on survey feedback, we want to break down the types of barriers to communication versus just saying this blanket statement across all topics of communication. You think about recognition, one-on-ones, giving feedback, my opinion seems to matter. All of that kind of ladders up into building communication, the communication muscle, whether it's that interpersonal and feedback level of communication, maybe there's a gap in communication of organizational strategy and success. So my advice when you're thinking about looking at results or thinking about how do I assess where my organization is at on communication and where we should focus, yes, that interpersonal and feedback level of communication is foundational to all other forms. And there's a couple different dynamics that you can look at, whether it's around, can you start with something simple like communicating appreciation for an individual? If you can share feedback, and feedback can be positive, oftentimes we think about feedback and the message being negative first, but feedback also comes in positive forms such as recognition. If you start with those areas, maybe that allows you to build that muscle when you're thinking about how to assess your broader communication issues in the organization, not just saying, well, we've got this massive topic of communication to work on as an organization. Beth, I'm not sure if you have anything to add from your experience with your clients or some suggestions for those on the phone today.
Sure, yeah, just briefly, Megan, you did a great job with that question. And truly, I do believe that indeed that it can be overwhelming when we think about communication breakdowns and how to figure out where the gap is. One of the things that I know at Fierce we often do with our clients is we ask a little bit more about what initiatives or goals are you trying to achieve? Because as you start to talk about what's our direction and where are we going, then you can drill down to what are the conversations that are going to be required to get us there. And so if we're talking about really on a larger scale, which a lot of our clients are doing these days, the performance management in general, and that's a big initiative for us. And we're looking at sort of being part of that sea change where we're moving away from annual performance reviews into an ongoing feedback conversation on a daily basis or weekly basis. Maybe that's a place where managers will need to skill up in terms of their ability to give feedback. That initiative may drive the priority for which types of conversations or communication do we want to target as an organization. So that's just a different way of looking at it, but one way that we at Fierce certainly consult with our clients is to really think long term. What are the business goals and initiatives? Because without those, you can't really determine priority-wise what is the communication that's going to be required or the skill.
Yep, I agree. Too often organizations jump into thinking they know. And that would be the other thing too, is a lot of times as leaders, when you get feedback from any type of venue that you have to work on communication, we often as leaders view our communication practices through our lens. So take the time, ask yourself deeper questions, ask yourself what gaps maybe your employees have on communications or your direct reports, rather than assuming from your lens that what needs to be improved. So I think time for one more question, Beth. I'm going to toss this at you to start. What happens when the miscommunication seems to be due to lack of understanding rather than lack of explanation?
That's a good one. So I love this question actually, because this is about, well, I've been really clear, right? As a leader, I know I have, I've laid it out, I've sent emails, I've been incredibly prescriptive, and yet there seems to be still a lack of understanding. So it can't be me, something else must be wrong. And I think whenever we detect as leaders that there's a lack of understanding and we truly believe that we've done everything to explain ourselves, that's when it's time for us to maybe stop talking and start asking. So I would simply ask, are you getting curious? Are you asking people to repeat back what they're hearing or what their assumptions or expectations are based on what you've been sharing? It really goes back to how much explaining are you doing and re-explaining and over-explaining versus slowing down and inviting the other person's perspective, response, understanding to come through. I think that's, to me, the key area as leaders where we can make a shift from talking and explaining to truly creating understanding on our teams. Just a tip.
That's great. All right. I think that is all for questions. Beth, Sylvie, anything to wrap up with before we let these folks go?
No, not here. I think I just say thank you on behalf of Fierce and Quantum Workplace. Megan and I had a blast. So thank you all so much for being here today.
Yes, I agree. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
And thank you to Beth Wagner and to Megan Maslenka for the very informative webcast today. I know the audience really enjoyed that. And we appreciate your sharing your knowledge. Just a few reminders to the attendees. If you'd like to view this webcast again, the archive recording and slides will be available for up to 7 days for our free members. And of course, our certification members have unlimited access. All webcast credits are stored in your HR.com account. Watch for your HR.com email to arrive within 1 to 2 business days, and that will contain your certification credit information. Your feedback is important to us, so please take a moment to fill in the exit survey that will appear on your screen once the webcast is ended. And that's another place that if you do have any additional questions that you have thought of, then you can certainly write them in there, and our presenters will reach out to you. This concludes our webcast, and enjoy the rest of your day.